All right, guys, this is a midterm review video about colonial culture in chapter 4. And so we're going to take a look at the emergence of colonial culture and the role that a couple of things played, particularly the Enlightenment and religion. Okay, so we're going to take a look at those two things, the Enlightenment and religion in colonial culture. So remember, we have 3 colonial regions in the English colonies, and so I'll draw a bad map of the North America there. And in these 3 colonial regions are New England, the Middle colonies, and the South. So we have New England, Middle, and the South. Okay, and so each of them had had unique elements to their colonial culture, and then there were also some elements of colonial culture that were common throughout all 3 regions. All right, so one of the first things that we want to point out is that New England was founded by Puritans, and so they had a strong foundation of religious values. Okay. Now, in Massachusetts, those religious values were Puritan, and that led Massachusetts to be governed by Puritan law and Puritan rules. And if you remember, that was very strict and led to things like a very strict social hierarchy with members of the church on top. Men were more important than women. And people who could not live in that Puritan lifestyle were banned. They were kicked out, like Anne Hutchinson and Roger Williams and Thomas Hooker. They disagreed. If you disagreed with some of the things the Puritan Church taught, you were banned and asked to leave. That strictness of Massachusetts and the Puritans also led to the development of some colonies where there was religious freedom, like Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire. These colonies all allowed religious freedom in their colonies because they disagreed with the strictness of Massachusetts. So the idea of religious values had a strong and profound impact on this particular region. Those religious values also played an important role in education. Every town in New England, in Massachusetts, and then eventually in New England, was required to have a school to teach the children, both boys and girls, how to read. Now, the purpose of that was to teach them Puritan values, the Bible, the difference between right and wrong. But it also led to the people in New England becoming very educated, from the aspect that they could all read. Okay. The Middle colonies also was influenced very strongly by religious values, but they were influenced more strongly by the religious values of the Quakers and the Catholics. Okay, so the Quakers were a very tolerant group of people. And so the Quakers allowed the practice of free religion. So there were some Catholics in Pennsylvania and in New York and New Jersey. There are lots of there's a pretty large community of Jewish people in New York. So because of this influence of the Quakers and the strong influence of the Quakers in this region, we saw a lot of religious tolerance, and they got along with Native Americans, where colonists in New England and the South pretty much did not. There was usually conflict between them and Native Americans, where Quakers tended to get along with them. And education also was important in the Middle colonies. There were opportunities for education and public schooling in many towns in Pennsylvania, New York, and New Jersey. And again, that led to this sort of educated, literate culture in the Middle colonies. Okay, in the South, the culture there was based on the plantation system. And in the plantation system, you had the landowners, you had free laborers, and then you had slave labor. So it was a very strict hierarchical system. And because of that, the people who owned land had a lot of power and influence and wealth, and those people that did not own land did not have the same thing. Religion wasn't necessarily as important in the South, though many people still practice it. The difference in the South was that you would find their adherence to the Church of England, which was the official Church of England, headed by the King of England himself. So this kind of made the South a little bit different, where in the Middle and New England colonies, you saw people belonging to churches and faiths that weren't necessarily part of or directly connected to England, but in the South, you did. Okay, and in the South, education was not really that important because the owners of plantations didn't really want laborers and slaves to be able to read. It was illegal to teach slaves to read, and there really weren't very many public schools. Most people that learned how to read were taught by their parents, and they tended to be the rich, educated, elite people. Okay, so that's kind of the difference between the three colonial regions and their cultures. But let's take a look at the colonies in general, and some of the things that they actually had in common. So one of the things that the colonies did have in common was that there was an intellectual movement that became popular, that was happening in Europe and became very popular in the colonies, and that intellectual movement was the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was all about focusing our education on science and reason to understand why things happen in the world. So the example that we used in class was, Benjamin Franklin and his famous, lightning experiment with the kite. Is lightning electricity? He's flying the kite, and there it is, and he finds out, electricity is natural in the environment, right? And so that idea of experimentation of science and reason and trying to figure out why things happen in the natural world became very popular in the colonies. And one of the reasons was because many people could read. So a lot of the books that people were writing in Europe, and a lot of the experiments that people were doing in Europe, or that people were doing in the colonies, were reprinted in newspapers or were printed in books. And Benjamin Franklin also helped create the public library system, where people could borrow books and read them. So if you want to read a book about science or reason or philosophy or something like that, you were able to do so in the colonies pretty easily, and certainly more easily than you were in a lot of places in Europe. So the colonists became very interested in these sorts of explanations for the natural world. This led to the development of a new kind of religious idea, almost like a new religious philosophy, called deism. And this is the idea that there is a God, but he does not control the world like Puritans and Catholics were teaching, but that God created people and gave people free will and left them to decide on their own. So the example that we used in class is like, kind of like the clockmaker, right? That a clockmaker creates a clock and leaves it alone, and it operates on its own. And that's kind of how a lot of people in the colonies started to approach this combination of religion and science. I can still believe in God, but I can also focus on religion and science. However, there was a backlash to this movement that tried to refocus people on old religious values in the colonies, and that was called the Great Awakening. As some of the old religious leaders started to lose power, particularly Puritans in New England and even Quakers in Pennsylvania, some preachers started to come back along and say, oh, no, wait a minute, hold on. God really is very important in our lives, and he really is the person who's determining whether we are successful or not. So the Great Awakening kind of led to this reinforcement of old religious values, and tried to convince people to come back to their old churches, like Puritanism and things like that. So you kind of have these two different cultural movements going on, where there's some people that are starting to focus on reason and science, and then there's also this movement back to this old kind of Puritan values. Both of these ideas, however, are not really that accepted in most of England. So what you start to get is this American culture where there's a lot of people believing in ideas that are not mainstream in Europe yet. And you start to develop this different colonial culture, this colonial culture of sort of rebellion, focus on science and reason, an emphasis on education, and kind of questioning the world around them. And that eventually is going to lead them to kind of question whether or not they should still be part of the English Empire.